He thought his father would be respected anywhere, but that night, even dignity had a waiting line. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe now. Back to Antonio Moretti. The restaurant glowed with a quiet kind of wealth, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, soft amber lights reflecting off polished marble floors, the faint clink of crystal glasses echoing beneath a ceiling that stretched higher than most people's expectations, and at a corner table near the back, just far enough to be forgotten, sat a man who once commanded respect without asking for it. Antonio Moretti adjusted his worn jacket, the fabric slightly too thin for the chill of the air conditioning, his fingers trembling not from fear, but from years that had settled deep into his bones, and in front of him, an untouched glass of water began to collect condensation like time slipping quietly past. No one had greeted him, no one had asked what he wanted, no one had even looked at him long enough to see him as anything more than a misplaced detail in a carefully curated room. Around him, waiters moved like choreography, smooth, efficient, attentive, but only to the right tables, the ones with tailored suits, polished watches, voices that carried confidence instead of hesitation. Antonio watched as a couple who arrived after him received menus within seconds, their laughter filling the space that had denied him even a glance. He cleared his throat once, softly, as if asking permission just to exist. "Excuse me," he tried, his accent wrapping around the words, thick and unpolished, betraying a history that didn't quite belong here. The waiter nearest him paused for half a second, eyes flicking toward him before moving on, as if the interruption had already been dismissed before it fully formed. Antonio lowered his hands slowly, nodding to no one, accepting a silence that felt heavier than rejection. It wasn't anger that settled in his chest, it was something quieter, something older, a memory, perhaps, of streets in southern Italy where voices were loud and hands were always reaching, where even strangers were treated like stories worth hearing. Here, he was just background. He reached for the menu left at the edge of the table, the words unfamiliar, descriptions long and polished, but distant, like a language he had learned too late in life. His lips moved slightly as he tried to pronounce a dish under his breath, the syllables stumbling, soft, unsure, and then stopping altogether when he noticed a glance from across the room, not cruel, not even intentional, just enough to remind him that he did not belong. The minutes stretched thin, each one adding weight to the silence around him, and somewhere near the entrance, a door opened, letting in a brief gust of night air before closing again, sealing the room back into its quiet hierarchy. Antonio sat still, hands folded now, posture straight out of habit, dignity clinging to him like the last thing no one could take, even when everything else had already been overlooked. And still, no one came. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted in small, almost invisible ways, like a room adjusting its posture without admitting it had been wrong, and Antonio Moretti felt it before he fully understood it, a presence approaching, slower than the others, not rushed, not rehearsed, just steady, as if the person walking toward him was not following the same invisible rules that governed everyone else. And when he finally lifted his eyes, it was not to a polished smile or a practiced greeting, but to a young woman standing beside his table, her uniform simple, her posture calm, her expression neither pitying nor distant, just present, fully present in a way the entire room had refused to be, and for a moment she said nothing, as if she was giving him the space to exist before placing any expectations on him, and then, gently, with a softness that carried weight beyond its volume, she spoke. "Buonasera, signore. Posso aiutarla?" The words landing in the air like something remembered rather than heard, and Antonio froze, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table, his breath catching not out of confusion but recognition, deep and immediate, the kind that bypasses thought entirely and settles straight into the chest. And slowly, almost carefully, he looked up at her again, searching her face as if to confirm that what he had just heard was real, that the language he had not spoken freely in years had not simply returned to him as a memory, and the room, which had been so full of movement moments ago, seemed to hesitate, not because anyone understood what had been said, but because something in the tone had shifted the air itself, and Antonio's lips parted, the hesitation gone now, replaced by something steadier, something older than the silence that had surrounded him. "See," he replied, his voice stronger, the syllable carrying warmth that had been absent just seconds before, and it was the first time that night he did not sound like a man asking for permission, but like someone reclaiming a space that had always been his. And the waitress, Ava, nodded slightly, not surprised, not impressed, simply acknowledging him in the same language he had been denied, her eyes attentive as he continued, his words flowing more easily now, describing a dish that was not even listed on the menu, something simple, something traditional, something that belonged to a place far from this polished room, and she listened without interruption, without correction, as if every word mattered, because to her, it did, and when he finished, there was no awkward pause, no confusion, just a quiet understanding as she repeated his request back to him in fluent Italian, confirming not just the order, but the dignity behind it, and in that moment, something subtle but undeniable shifted across the restaurant, heads turning, conversations lowering, not out of curiosity alone, but because the invisible line that had kept Antonio separate from the rest had just been erased without announcement, and near the entrance, just beyond the soft glow of the main dining area, a man had stopped mid-step, his attention drawn not by the scene itself, but by the language, by the precision of it, by the familiarity that cut through the noise of everything else. Vincent Moretti did not move, his gaze fixed across the room, his expression unreadable, but there was a stillness to him now, the kind that only appeared when something unexpected demanded his full attention, and as Ava spoke again, her tone respectful, her words effortless, Vincent felt something shift, not in the room, but within himself, because what he was hearing was not just Italian, it was something far more specific, something rooted, something that should not have existed here, not in this place, not from someone like her, and for the first time that night, the balance of power did not belong to the room, it belonged to a single voice that had chosen to see what everyone else had ignored. Vincent Moretti did not move, not because he was unsure, but because something far more dangerous than uncertainty had taken hold of him, recognition, the kind that did not come from faces or names, but from details so precise they could not be faked. And as Ava continued speaking, her voice steady, her tone respectful yet natural, Vincent felt the past press quietly against the present. Because the Italian she spoke was not the polished version taught in classrooms or rehearsed in films, it carried the subtle rhythm of a region, a cadence shaped by hills, by narrow streets, by conversations held over long tables and slow evenings, and he knew that sound, not as a language, but as a memory, something tied to childhood summers and a father who once spoke freely before time and distance had turned his words into fragments. And across the room, Antonio Moretti sat straighter now, his hands no longer folded in quiet resignation, but resting openly on the table as he spoke, his voice gaining strength with each sentence, describing flavors, recalling ingredients, even offering a small correction when Ava repeated something slightly differently, and instead of apologizing, she smiled faintly and adjusted, not as someone being corrected, but as someone listening carefully enough to care, and it was that detail, that willingness to adapt without losing confidence, that made the difference. Because this was no performance, no attempt to impress, it was understanding, real and grounded, and the surrounding tables had begun to notice, not the words themselves, but the shift in posture, in energy, in presence, the way the old man who had been invisible moments ago now seemed anchored, undeniable, and a quiet ripple moved through the staff, a glance here, a hesitation there, as if the rules they had followed so easily were suddenly being questioned without anyone daring to say it aloud, and near the center of the dining room, the manager slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the interaction, not fully understanding what was being said, but sensing that something had changed, something he had not approved, and yet had no immediate control over, and Vincent, still standing near the entrance, finally took a step forward, slow, deliberate, his gaze never leaving the table where his father sat, because now he saw more than just the language, he saw the difference it had made, the way Antonio's shoulders had lifted, the way his eyes met Ava's without hesitation, the way his voice carried not just words, but identity. And Vincent understood something in that moment that power had never taught him, that respect was not given by position, it was revealed by attention. And as Ava finished taking the order, she did something no one else had done that night, she paused, just briefly, and said something else in Italian, softer this time, a phrase that did not belong to menus or service, but to people, something simple, something human, and Antonio's expression shifted again, not to surprise, but to recognition, deeper than before, and Vincent stopped mid-step, his breath held for a fraction longer than necessary, because he knew that phrase. He had heard it as a child, spoken by his mother in a kitchen far from this polished room, a dialect so specific it could only come from one place, one small village that most people could not even find on a map, and as the realization settled in, Vincent felt the room fall away, the noise, the lights, the expectations, all of it fading behind a single, undeniable truth: this woman did not just understand his father, she understood where he came from, and that was something no amount of power could command, only recognize, and for the first time that night, Vincent Moretti was not the most important presence in the room, because dignity, quiet and unshaken, had already taken its place. The manager's shoes slowed against the polished floor, the subtle shift in rhythm enough to draw the attention of nearby staff, because he was not a man who hesitated, not in a place that operated under his control, and yet now he stood just far enough to observe without interrupting, his eyes fixed on Ava as she finished confirming the order, his expression tightening not out of anger, but discomfort, the kind that came when something unfamiliar challenged a system built on quiet assumptions. And across the room, Vincent Moretti continued forward, each step measured, his presence beginning to ripple through the space in a way that did not need announcement, because people noticed, they always noticed, not through sound, but through instinct, conversations softening, shoulders straightening, waiters adjusting their posture without understanding why, and yet Vincent did not look at them, did not acknowledge the subtle shift of authority that followed him, because his focus remained on a single table, on a single moment that had already changed the balance of the room, and as he approached, Ava stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but out of respect for the space she had just restored, her eyes briefly lifting to meet Vincent's before returning to Antonio, as if the hierarchy that governed everyone else did not fully apply to her, and Antonio, who had not yet noticed his son's arrival, continued speaking softly, his voice now carrying a warmth that had been absent when he first entered, telling a small story about a dish his wife used to make, something simple, something that did not belong in a place like this, and Ava listened, not rushing, not interrupting, allowing the memory to exist as part of the moment rather than something to move past, and when Vincent finally reached the table, he did not speak immediately, did not announce himself, he simply stood there for a second longer than expected, watching, taking in the detail that mattered, the way his father's hands moved more freely, the way his voice no longer asked for permission, and when Antonio finally looked up, the recognition was immediate. But not dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgment, a slight nod that carried more meaning than any greeting, and Vincent returned it with the same restraint, his gaze softening in a way few had ever seen, before shifting back to Ava, who remained composed, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had not just altered the atmosphere of the entire room, and the manager, sensing the shift too late, stepped forward with a forced smile, his voice carefully measured, "Is everything all right here?" But the question felt unnecessary the moment it was spoken, because the answer was already visible, not in words, but in presence, and Vincent turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, his expression calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm, and without raising his voice, without creating a scene, he said, "Everything is exactly as it should be," and in that sentence, something settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that left no room for correction, and the manager nodded quickly, stepping back, the structure he relied on quietly rearranging itself without instruction, and Ava, after a brief pause, inclined her head respectfully before turning to leave, her movements as steady as when she arrived, as if she had simply done her job and nothing more, but Vincent watched her for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because something in her presence refused to be dismissed, something that could not be measured in service or status, and as she disappeared into the flow of the restaurant, the room slowly returned to motion, conversations resuming, glasses clinking, but the difference remained, subtle and undeniable, because from that moment on, no one at that table was invisible, and no one who had witnessed it would forget what it looked like when dignity was recognized without being requested. The rhythm of the restaurant returned, but it was no longer the same rhythm that had ignored Antonio when he first sat down, because something invisible had been corrected, not through instruction, but through awareness, and Vincent Moretti remained standing for a moment beside his father, not as a man asserting control, but as a son. Recalibrating what truly mattered, his gaze shifting briefly toward the staff, not with anger, but with clarity, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be understood, and slowly, he took the seat across from Antonio, his movements deliberate, his posture relaxed in a way that only appeared when he chose it, and for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, not out of discomfort, but because silence now carried something different, something earned, and Antonio glanced around the room. Noticing the subtle changes, the way a nearby waiter adjusted his stance, the way another table had grown quieter, and he gave a small nod, not to Vincent, but to the space itself, as if acknowledging that something had been restored, and when he finally spoke, it was not about the delay, not about the neglect, but about the moment that had changed everything. "She speaks like home," he said softly, his voice steady, and Vincent did not respond immediately, because he understood that this was not just about language, it was about recognition, about being seen in a way that did not require explanation, and he followed his father's gaze toward the kitchen entrance where Ava had disappeared moments earlier, his expression thoughtful, measured, and for the first time that night, there was something beneath the control he was known for, something closer to respect, and as the minutes passed, the service around them shifted with noticeable precision, menus were adjusted, water was refilled without delay, the attention that had been withheld was now present in careful detail, not exaggerated, not performative, but consistent, as if the room itself had learned something it could not unlearn, and when Ava returned, carrying a tray with simple elegance, the conversation around the restaurant lowered once again, not intentionally, but instinctively, because people sensed that this moment mattered in ways they could not fully explain, and she approached the table with the same calm presence, placing the dish in front of Antonio with a slight nod, her movements unhurried, her focus exact, and before stepping back, she spoke again in Italian, her tone warm, almost familiar, offering a small detail about the preparation, something she had adjusted based on his earlier description, and Antonio looked at the plate, then back at her, his eyes softening in a way that carried years of distance closing all at once, and he responded quietly, his voice filled with something deeper than gratitude, something closer to recognition, and Vincent watched this exchange without interruption, his hands resting lightly on the table, his usual authority replaced by observation, because this was not a moment to control, it was a moment to understand, and as Ava stepped back once more, preparing to leave, Vincent spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a calm certainty that carried across the space, "What is your name?" And the question was simple, but it held weight, because it was not asked out of formality, but intention, and Ava turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Ava, sir," she replied, her voice steady, and Vincent gave a small nod, as if committing it to memory, not as a detail, but as something that mattered, and for a brief moment, nothing else moved, the room pausing in that quiet space between action and meaning, because everyone understood, without needing to be told, that something had shifted, not just for one table, but for the way respect would be measured from that point forward. Vincent did not look away immediately after hearing her name, as if repeating it silently would anchor something he had only just begun to understand, and Ava gave a small nod before turning back toward the kitchen, her steps measured, her presence fading into the rhythm of the restaurant without leaving a trace of disruption, yet the absence she left behind felt more noticeable than her arrival, because now the room knew what it had missed before, and Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair. His eyes shifting to his father, who had already taken the first bite of the meal, his expression changing in a way that required no translation, the tension in his shoulders easing, his posture settling into something familiar, something that belonged not to this place, but to a memory carried across years and oceans, and for a moment, Vincent said nothing. Simply watching, because this was not about the food itself, it was about what it restored, and Antonio placed his fork down carefully, his gaze lifting with a quiet certainty. "She did not just learn the language," he said, his voice low but firm, "she lived it," and Vincent nodded slightly, the statement landing deeper than it appeared, because he knew the difference, knew that fluency could be taught, but belonging could not, and as the realization settled, his attention shifted beyond the table, scanning the room not with suspicion, but with evaluation, noticing the staff more clearly now, the patterns of movement, the subtle hierarchies that had been invisible until this moment, and he saw it all, the hesitation, the assumptions, the quiet decisions made without question, and he understood that none of it had been challenged until now, until one person chose to act differently, and that detail, that choice, carried more weight than any rule he could enforce. And across the dining room, the manager remained attentive, his posture tightened, his smile carefully maintained, but there was a difference now, a cautious awareness that had not been there before, and Vincent rose slowly from his seat, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with intention, his movement enough to draw attention without demanding it, and as he walked toward the center of the room, the staff adjusted instinctively, creating space, lowering their voices, because his presence carried its own gravity, and yet he did not address them directly, did not call anyone out, did not raise his voice. Instead he stopped near the service station, his gaze steady as he spoke in a calm, even tone. Everyone in this room deserves to be seen the first time, and the sentence was simple, almost understated, but it carried a weight that settled across the entire space, because it was not a suggestion, it was a standard. And no one responded immediately, not because they did not hear him, but because they understood that the expectation had just changed, and Vincent turned back toward the table without waiting for acknowledgment, because he did not need it, and as he returned to his seat, the atmosphere followed him, quieter, more aware, more precise, and in the distance, Ava paused briefly near the kitchen entrance, her eyes lifting for just a second before continuing her work, not seeking recognition, not expecting anything in return, because what she had done was never meant to be seen as extraordinary, and that was what made it matter. And Antonio watched his son settle back into his chair, a faint smile forming, not proud, not surprised, just certain, as if he had been waiting for this understanding to arrive, and in that moment, the room no longer felt divided by status or silence, because something more fundamental had taken its place, something that could not be measured in service or power, but only in the quiet way people chose to see one another when it mattered most. The words Vincent had spoken did not echo, they settled, quietly embedding themselves into the rhythm of the restaurant in a way that could not be undone, and the change was immediate, not loud, not forced, but visible in the smallest details, a waiter pausing an extra second at a table he might have passed before, a hostess adjusting her tone as she greeted a guest who did not fit the usual image, and at the center of it all, Antonio Moretti continued his meal, no longer as a man waiting to be acknowledged, but as someone who had already been seen, his movements unhurried, his presence grounded, and across from him, Vincent watched not just his father, but the space around him, the subtle recalibration of attention that followed a single moment of clarity, and it was then that he realized something that power had never required him to learn, that respect was not maintained by control, but by consistency, by the quiet choices made when no one was being watched. And as that thought settled, his gaze shifted once more toward the kitchen, where Ava moved with the same steady rhythm as before, carrying plates, exchanging brief words with other staff, her presence blending seamlessly into the flow. And yet now, everyone noticed her, not because she demanded it, but because she had redefined what it meant to be present. And near the service station, the manager adjusted his tie, his posture straighter now, his attention sharper, not out of fear, but awareness, because the standard had changed, and he understood that it would not return to what it had been before. And as the evening continued, the restaurant filled with the same sounds it always had, laughter, conversation, the soft clink of silverware, but beneath it all, there was something different, a quiet attentiveness that had not existed earlier, as if the room itself had learned to listen. And when Ava approached the table again, this time to refill water glasses, she did so without hesitation, her movements precise, her expression calm, and Antonio looked up at her with a familiarity that had grown in a matter of minutes, speaking to her again in Italian, his tone lighter now, almost conversational, sharing a small comment about the meal, and she responded just as naturally, her words flowing with the same ease, not as a performance, but as a continuation. And Vincent listened, not to the content of their exchange, but to the tone, the balance, the mutual recognition that had formed between them. And it was in that moment that he understood the full weight of what had happened, that this was not about a single act of kindness, but about a shift in perspective, one that could not be reversed once seen clearly. And as Ava finished and stepped back, Vincent spoke again, his voice low but certain, "You changed something tonight." And the statement was not a question, not a compliment, but an acknowledgment. And Ava paused, just briefly, her eyes meeting his, not with surprise, but with quiet understanding, and she gave a small nod, not accepting credit, but recognizing the truth in what he had said, before continuing on her way, because for her, the work had not changed, only the way it was seen. And Antonio watched this exchange with a faint smile, his eyes reflecting something deeper than satisfaction, Something closer to peace, as if the distance between past and present had been bridged, not by time, but by a simple act of recognition, and Vincent, sitting back once more, allowed himself a moment of stillness, the kind that did not come from control, but from clarity, because in a room built on power, it had taken a single voice, spoken with respect, to remind everyone what dignity actually looked like. By the time dessert menus were offered, the restaurant no longer felt like a place divided by quiet assumptions, it felt observed, aware, as if every movement carried a subtle intention that had not existed earlier in the night, and Vincent Moretti noticed it in the smallest details, the way a server adjusted his tone before speaking, the way a guest who had once been overlooked was now greeted with steady eye contact. And it was not perfection, not a sudden transformation, but it was different. And different was enough to matter, and across from him, Antonio Moretti leaned back slightly in his chair, his meal nearly finished, his expression calm, his presence no longer weighed down by the silence that had greeted him when he arrived, and he watched the room with a quiet understanding, as if he had seen this shift before in another place, another time, where respect was not a performance, but a habit, and Vincent followed his gaze, taking in the atmosphere that had changed without announcement, and he realized that this moment would not be remembered for what had been served or who had been present, but for what had been corrected, and as that thought settled, Ava returned once more, this time carrying a small plate, something not listed on the menu, something simple, and she placed it gently in front of Antonio, her movements careful, her expression steady, and before stepping back, she spoke again in Italian, her voice soft, offering a quiet explanation, not of the dish itself, but of why she had chosen it, something light, something familiar, something that belonged to the memory he had shared earlier, and Antonio looked at the plate, then at her, his eyes reflecting something deeper than appreciation, something closer to recognition of effort, of thought, of care, and he nodded slowly, his voice low as he responded, not just thanking her, but acknowledging what she had understood without being told, and Vincent watched this exchange with a stillness that carried more weight than any command, because he knew that what had just happened could not be taught in training manuals or enforced through rules, it came from a place beyond obligation, and as Ava stepped back, preparing to leave, Vincent spoke again, not to call her back, but to hold the moment in place. You remembered, he said, his voice even, and Ava paused, turning slightly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes steady. People remember when they are heard, she replied simply, and the words settled between them, not as a lesson, but as a truth that did not need to be explained, and for a moment, the room seemed to quiet again, not because anyone had demanded it, but because something honest had been spoken, and Vincent gave a small nod, not in authority, but in agreement, as if acknowledging a standard that he had not set, but now recognized, and as Ava continued on, disappearing once more into the rhythm of the restaurant, the difference she had made remained, not as a disruption, but as a new baseline, something that would shape every interaction that followed, and Antonio lifted his fork, tasting the dish in front of him, his expression softening further, and he closed his eyes briefly, not in exaggeration, but in quiet appreciation, and when he opened them again, he looked at Vincent with a certainty that needed no translation, because both of them understood that this night was no longer about a meal, it was about a reminder that dignity does not arrive with status, it arrives with attention, and once given, it changes everything. The night did not end with applause or raised voices or anything that would draw attention from the outside world, it ended the way most important things do, quietly, with a shift that only those present could fully understand, and as the final plates were cleared and the soft glow of the restaurant settled into a slower rhythm, Vincent Moretti remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze moving across the room not as a man surveying his domain, but as someone seeing it for the first time without the filter of expectation, and everywhere he looked, there were small changes, subtle but undeniable, a waiter pausing to listen instead of rushing past, a guest being acknowledged without hesitation, a tone of voice adjusted not for status, but for respect, and none of it was dramatic, none of it demanded recognition, but it was real, and that was what made it lasting, and across from him, Antonio Moretti placed his napkin gently on the table, his movements unhurried, his expression calm in a way that came from something deeper than satisfaction, and when he stood, he did not look back at the room with disappointment or judgment, he simply nodded once, as if acknowledging that something had been restored, something that had always mattered, and Vincent stood with him, his posture steady, his presence quieter now, not diminished, but refined, as if the weight he carried had been reshaped into something more deliberate, and as they prepared to leave, Ava appeared once more near the entrance, not waiting, not positioned for recognition, simply doing her work, her hands steady, her focus unchanged. And Vincent paused, just briefly, his eyes meeting hers one last time. Not as a gesture of authority, but of understanding, and he gave a small nod, the kind that did not need explanation, because it carried acknowledgment, respect, and something unspoken that would remain long after the moment passed, and Ava returned it with the same quiet composure, not lowering her gaze, not seeking approval, just recognizing the exchange for what it was, and then she turned back to her work, because for her, the value of what had happened did not depend on who noticed, it depended on the fact that it had been done at all, and as Vincent and Antonio stepped out into the night, the cool air replacing the warmth of the dining room, neither of them spoke immediately, not because there was nothing to say, but because some things were better left understood, and after a few steps, Antonio glanced at his son, his voice calm, carrying the weight of years that had taught him what truly mattered. "Respect is not something you give when it is easy," he said, "it is something you show when no one expects it." And Vincent listened, not as a lesson, but as a confirmation of something he had just witnessed, something that had changed the way he would see every room from that night forward. And as they walked away, the restaurant behind them continued its quiet rhythm, but it was no longer the same place it had been hours before, because somewhere between silence and recognition, a single choice had redefined the standard, and no one who had been there would ever mistake absence for invisibility again. And that night, without announcement, without spectacle, the world inside those walls remembered what dignity looks like.